Hello class, this is video 11. In video 11, we're looking at extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the hand. So, first of all, what the heck does that mean? Extrinsic muscles of the hand are muscles that originate or begin outside the hand and insert or end inside the hand somewhere and then move the hand. That's an extrinsic hand muscle. And then intrinsic hand muscles are muscles that begin and end within the hand. So the extrinsic hand muscles we are also going to call the flexors and extensors of the forearm. And we kind of had a little bit of a sneak peek at those guys in the last video when we were looking at pronator teres and pronator quadratus and supinator and those guys. So now we're going to take a complete walk through the flexors of the forearm, the extensors of the forearm. So those two groups are the extrinsic hand muscles, and then the intrinsic hand muscles are the muscles within the hand, and we'll take a look at those two. So we are going to do some coloring here together today. We're starting on coloring book page 360, and so let's orient ourselves to this diagram here first of all. So there are, I sure hope you can see this super well, but if you can only see it moderately well, you do have your own and you can color right along with me. This is like, you know, wasn't there like Captain Kangaroo or something, right? Childhood shows where you color along with the person. Anyway, okay, here we go. So first of all, let's orient ourselves on this diagram. So this is an anterior view of the right forearm. Okay, so find your own right forearm, the anterior side of it, right? Find that. That's what we're looking at here. Let's find a few muscles that we have already looked at. So here's biceps brachii right here, and you know, of course, totally feel free to color that if you want. I'm just going to color the ones that we are covering today because I have a very limited color palette, unfortunately. So here's biceps brachii, and one of the things when we were looking at biceps brachii that you probably noticed, and I mentioned just briefly, is there's part of its tendon is here and goes down deep and attaches to the radius, but it also has this kind of extension, this superficial extension off of here that is called, it's labeled on here. Where is it labeled? I thought it was labeled on here. Oh, I labeled it right here, bicipital aponeurosis. So what is an aponeurosis? This is the first one that we've seen. We have these throughout the body. An aponeurosis is basically a broad, flat tendon. So, so it's a tendon that covers a broad area, and often it can kind of, well, I guess that's just that. It covers a broad area. There's one on the scalp. This right here is the bicipital aponeurosis. We're going to see one on the palm of the hand, on the sole of the foot. So it's a broad, flat tendon. And so what this bicipital aponeurosis is doing, in addition to being the insertion for biceps brachii, is it kind of helps to hold these forearm muscles in place. It sort of, you know, kind of is this patch in a sense over this strong connective tissue that helps keep these guys all in place. So that's the bicipital aponeurosis. So it kind of is continuous with the fascia, fascia of this area, and the fascia, of course, is the covering of the muscles, and you know, the fascia interconnects with all of the soft tissue of the body. All right, so, okay, back to orienting ourselves. We're looking at an anterior view of the right forearm. This is biceps brachii. Here's brachialis. So brachialis is deep to biceps brachii. We can see a little bit of triceps brachii here, even though we're looking at a view of the anterior arm. Triceps brachii is bulky enough that it kind of peeks out from behind, so we can see a little bit of it there. Let's look at a couple of other structures. Oh, here's another muscle that we just did, brachioradialis, right here. So that's number 3 on this diagram, brachioradialis. But let's look at a couple of other structures that we have here. So here's the median nerve up here. And it runs right by the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So if you bump that medial epicondyle of the humerus, you go, ooh, ow, that's a weird, funny, horrible sensation. You go, oh, I just bumped my funny bone. Your funny bone is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and that nervy sensation comes from the median nerve. That median nerve comes down here. It's going to go deep. Of course, we don't see it through this region, but down here it is again. And the median nerve is the nerve that goes through the carpal tunnel. So it's going to go deep to these right here, which are the transverse fibers of the palmar aponeurosis. Oh, there's another aponeurosis. Here's the palmar aponeurosis. And these are the transverse fibers that essentially are the superficial fibers. That there are deep fibers that are here also, if we peek ahead, that are called the flexor retinaculum, that really help to keep these tendons on the anterior side of the forearm in place. Okay, so the muscles of the forearm, okay, a couple others that we've already talked about, so we can find these guys on here. Pronator teres is right here. It's number 12 on this diagram. There's pronator teres, and that might be about it for the ones that we've already looked at. Okay, biceps brachii, brachialis, little triceps brachii right there. Pronator teres, brachioradialis. Okay, now let's look at our new muscles for today. So when we look at the forearm muscles, we're going to look at them in layers. And so what we're looking at here is the superficial layer. And then the next page we'll look at is the intermediate layer, and then we'll look at a deep layer. So this superficial layer, there are three main muscles that we're going to look at. And if you have looked at your objectives, you've seen the information about the names of these muscles. And the names of these muscles are far more important than understanding the names of these muscles is more important than memorizing the location and actions of these muscles, because their names tell you everything that you need to know. So let's just briefly review what happens with the names of these muscles, and then we'll go through these three and see how that more or less works most of the time. So the muscles that we're going to look at have typically have three names to them. The first name tells you the action. And so we're going to see words like flexor, extensor, opponens, abductor, adductor. So those are all action words. And so that tells us something about, tells us an action that muscle does. But we know how muscles work, right? So we know that if we know the action of a muscle, for instance, if we're looking at muscles of the forearm and it's called a flexor, we know where it has to be. If it flexes the elbow or flexes the wrist, it has to be on the anterior side of the forearm, right? So the first word of the three-word name of these muscles is the action, but that tells us about the action, which also tells us something about the location. Okay? So if it's a flexor, it's on the anterior side. If it's an extensor, it's on the posterior side. If it's an adductor or an abductor, it needs to be positioned appropriately to do that action. The second word in the name of these muscles is its distal attachment. So we're going to see words like carpi, digitorum, digiti minimi, pollicis, indicis. Each of these words indicates a different specific distal attachment. And so knowing the distal attachment also tells us more about where the muscle is more specifically, but it also is going to tell us something more about the action of the muscle. So basically, these muscles work strongest on the joint, on the next most proximal joint to their distal attachment. So if their distal attachment is the carpals, they work most strongly on the wrist. If the distal attachment is the proximal phalanges, they're going to work most strongly on the metacarpal phalangeal joints. Okay, so the next most proximal joint from the distal attachment, that's the joint that they work on the strongest. So the second word in the name is going to tell us the distal attachment, which also tells us the joint that they work on the strongest. So first word action, second word distal attachment. Third word is going to tell us more about the location. And specifically, it's going to differentiate that muscle from another one that's in a similar location. So here we're going to see words like radialis, ulnaris, superficialis, profundus. And so very often what we're going to see is this word, longus and brevis, those are common ones also. They'll often go in pairs. And, because if we didn't need to differentiate one muscle from another, or let me say that differently, needing to differentiate one muscle from another means that that we're sort of comparing two muscles. So if we're saying one muscle is named flexor carpi radialis, then we know its action is flexion, its distal attachment is the carpals, flexor carpi. Radialis, the third word, tells us that it's on the radial side of the forearm. But it also tells us that we need to distinguish it from another muscle, flexor carpi ulnaris. Did I just say radialis and then ulnaris? I hope that's what I meant to say. So flexor carpi radialis, to distinguish it from flexor carpi ulnaris. So ulnaris is going to be, flexor carpi ulnaris will be a flexor, so it's on the anterior side of the forearm. Carpi, so it does flexion at the carpals, or its distal attachment is the carpals, and so it works strongest on the wrist. And it's on the ulnar side of the forearm. And that distinguishes it from flexor carpi radialis, which is on the radial side. So we're going to see that sort of thing coming up with most of these muscles. And so if we understand how that works, we are going to get a lot of information from the name of the muscles, to the extent that if we're looking at a muscle, we should be able to figure out its name based on its location, because these muscles are very regular in the way that they work. Okay, so back to the muscles. Let's take a look at the three that are in the superficial layer of the anterior side of the forearm. Okay, so we're going to look at two that I just used their names as examples of, and those are flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris. So let's go ahead and start with flexor carpi radialis. So that's number 13 on this diagram. So it's a flexor, so it's on the anterior side of the forearm. So it does actually come up all the way. So there's a common attachment up here for the flexors of the forearm, especially this superficial layer. Their common attachment is the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So sometimes it's these flexors whose tendons are inflamed if someone is experiencing medial epicondylitis, or inflammation of that medial epicondyle. All right, so here is flexor carpi radialis. Here's where its name is. And so its proximal attachment is the medial epicondyle of the humerus. It has a common, it shares a common attachment there. If we follow its tendon down, we're not going to see in this diagram exactly where it inserts, but we know from the name that it attaches on a carpal or just beyond the carpals. So flexor carpi and then radialis. So meaning that it's more on the radial side of the forearm. So in this diagram, again, we're looking at the anterior side. So this over here is the radial or the lateral aspect of the forearm. Over here we have the ulnar or the medial side of the forearm. And so flexor carpi radialis flexes the wrist. It also flexes the elbow, but not as strongly. Primarily what it does is it flexes the wrist. Also, it being over here on the radial side, it does it does radial deviation to the wrist. But more strongly, it's going to do flexion at the wrist. So that's flexor carpi radialis. Let's look at the one with sort of the paired name, which is flexor carpi ulnaris, which is number 15 on this diagram. So sharing this same proximal attachment, and notice how both of these are under that bicipital aponeurosis. This one's going to come down. By its name, we know exactly where it's going to come down to. It's going to come down to a carpal on the ulnar side of the forearm. So flexor carpi ulnaris is here. So flexor, it's a flexor. It's on the anterior side of the forearm. Carpi, it attaches at the carpal. So the joint that it works strongest on is the wrist. And ulnaris is on the ulnar side of the forearm, which distinguishes it from radialis, which is on the radial side of the forearm. Okay, so flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris. In between the two of them, we have palmaris longus. So it's the first muscle that breaks the rule that I just so carefully laid out for you. But if we can pretend that palmaris longus just decided to drop its first name, because what would its first name be? So notice that palmaris longus only has 2 words in its name and not 3. So if we gave it a first name, it would certainly be flexor, right? Flexor palmaris longus. And then it would totally follow the rule, because it's a flexor. It's on the anterior side of the forearm. Its distal attachment is the palm. In essence, it's the palmar aponeurosis down here. That's where palmaris longus attaches, and it's palmaris longus, which gives us a clue that somewhere in this jumble of muscles we're going to find a palmaris brevis. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to distinguish palmaris longus from it. Okay, so those are the first 3. Those are the 3 muscles that are on the superficial layer. So we can see some that are in the deeper layers here. So for instance, excuse me, we can see flexor digitorum superficialis, which is the next one that we're going to look at. And let's go ahead and color it here, and then we'll go to the next page and look at it there too. So flexor digitorum superficialis, now we have it, this is a new word for our distal attachment. Flexor is not a new word, so it's on the anterior side of the forearm, so it's a flexor. Digitorum refers to the digits. So flexor digitorum is going to have, and digitorum specifically means like all of the digits, pretty much, because in these muscles, if a muscle goes to a specific digit, it will be named for that specific digit, and the thumb has all its own muscles. So if a muscle goes to several digits, it won't go to the thumb, because the thumb will always have its own. So calling it digitorum implies it goes to digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. So it means all of the digits except for the thumb. So flexor digitorum superficialis, so that third word superficialis just means that it's superficial to another one in the similar area that's going to be deep, but the word we're going to use for that is profundus, right? Like the word profound. If something is profound, it's deep. Okay, so flexor digitorum superficialis, since it goes to the digits, we have digitorum in its name, we know that what it's going to do is it's going to flex the digits. It's actually going to flex the metacarpal phalangeal joints. But I don't want you guys to get crazy about learning the specific actions with these muscles. I mostly want you to know where they are so that you can use their tendons for references for finding points. Okay, so that's the superficial layer. Let's move on to the intermediate layer. So here we're looking at the same view. So this is an anterior view of the right forearm. This is page 361 now in the coloring book. We have the lateral side is over here, the medial side is over here, meaning that the lateral side or the radial side or the thumb side is this side of the diagram, and the ulnar side or the pinky side is this side of the diagram. We can still see the median nerve along here. We can see a little more of it here, and then the median nerve here. We can also see here now we can see the ulnar nerve. So the median nerve goes deep to the flexor retinaculum. It goes through the carpal tunnel, whereas the ulnar nerve is superficial to the carpal tunnel and can also create kind of nervy sensations at the wrist. But the median nerve, when we look at points, we'll see what point is very close to the median nerve. And look what we can see here. What is this red one here is the radial artery. Seems like we've heard of the radial artery before, right? The radial artery, where have I heard of that? Oh, that's where we take pulses, right? That's a very important artery for us. We're going to take pulses right there. Okay, let's look at our deep layer, or our intermediate layer. We're looking at flexor digitorum superficialis here on this intermediate layer. So here's our muscle, flexor digitorum superficialis, and it's here. So there's another layer deep to it, so we can see that there are other things below this muscle here. And I'll also show you in a second here what we cut away to get this view. Okay, so we can see biceps brachii, but that's cut away here. We can see brachialis. But look here, this is what I wanted to show you, what's cut away. So pronator teres is cut away in this view, and we can see some deeper aspect of brachialis right there. Flexor carpi radialis is cut away, palmaris longus is cut away, flexor carpi ulnaris is not cut away in this view, but we can see those two tendons. So these were the three we looked at on the superficial layer. They're all attaching here at the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So the next layer down, this intermediate layer where flexor digitorum superficialis is, it's almost as long as those muscles. It attaches, very close up here and then down here on the radius and ulna and interosseous membrane. And then it's going to come down. So flexor digitorum, it's going to digits 2 through 5, but it's superficial to another muscle. And what it's going to do is it's going to flex the metacarpal phalangeal joints. Let's look at the deep layer now. So at this deep layer, there are two muscles that I want to point out on the deep layer. So first of all, let's orient ourselves. So we're looking still at an anterior view of the right forearm. This is the deep layer, though. We've completely removed biceps brachii, so this is brachialis that we can see here. We can see cutaway pronator teres. We can see cutaway flexor carpi radialis, palmaris longus, flexor carpi ulnaris. So those were our three of our superficial layer. We can see the cutaway tendon here of flexor digitorum superficialis. Okay, so that's cut right there. And we can see a little pronator teres here, but we've cut that away as well, so we can see this deep layer. Let me see here, what else? So the two, and then, remember this guy? That's one that we did in the last video, pronator quadratus. So pronator quadratus is deep to this deep layer that we're doing right here. Oh, here's the other end of flexor carpi ulnaris, so we can see exactly where it's attaching right there. And here's the other end of flexor carpi radialis. Okay, let's look at the muscles on this level. There are two of them. So we have flexor digitorum profundus. So flexor digitorum profundus, that's the one that has the same name as flexor digitorum superficialis, but it is deep to it. So it's a flexor, so meaning that it's on the anterior side of the forearm. Digitorum, meaning that it goes to the digits. Which digits? Digits 2 through 5. And you can see here, you can see these individual tendons that are heading out to digits 2 through 5 here. Why not digit 1? Remember, because the thumb has its own muscles always. Okay, so there's flexor digitorum profundus. And so profundus just means that it's deep to flexor digitorum superficialis. Flexor digitorum profundus, we can't see it here, but these tendons go all the way out to the distal phalanges of digits 2 through 5. I think I do have a page here where we can see it. Well, when we get into the hand, we can see it. But anyway, it goes all the way out to the distal phalanges. And so flexor digitorum profundus flexes the interphalangeal joints, both the proximal and the distal interphalangeal joints. And then our last one here that we want to talk about is flexor pollicis longus. So flexor pollicis longus is here. It's on that deep layer, so it's a flexor, so which means it's on the anterior side of the forearm, Pollicis is our word that refers to the thumb. So any muscle that goes to the thumb, we're going to see that pollicis word. Flexor pollicis longus, which tells us two things. One is that it's a long muscle, meaning it's an extrinsic hand muscle, meaning that it begins outside the hand but ends within the hand somewhere. And but this tendon is cut. Where does it pick up here? Let's see, right here it picks up. And it goes then to the first metacarpal. So, if this was continuous, they cut this so that we could see pronator quadratus deep to it, which was thoughtful of them, but we can draw it in too if we want. And there's the whole muscle. Okay, flexor pollicis longus. So flexor, meaning that it flexes. What does it flex? It flexes the thumb. Flexor pollicis, it goes to the thumb, it flexes the thumb. Flexor pollicis longus tells us it's an extrinsic hand muscle, not an intrinsic hand muscle, but we will find an intrinsic hand muscle with the name of flexor pollicis brevis. Okay, so that's it for the anterior side of the forearm. So we had 3 layers of muscles on the anterior side of the forearm. This is the deepest layer with flexor pollicis longus, a flexor that goes to the thumb, and it's an extrinsic hand muscle. It flexes the thumb. Flexor digitorum profundus, that is a flexor and goes to digits 2 through 5 and flexes the interphalangeal joints. And it's deep, flexor digitorum profundus. At the intermediate layer, we had flexor digitorum superficialis, so it also goes to digits 2 through 5 and flexes the metacarpal phalangeal joints, and is superficial to flexor digitorum profundus, but it's deep to the superficial layer, which is these 3, which are flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, the green one, and palmaris longus, the orange one. And these 3 muscles all flex the wrist. Flexor carpi radialis attaches on the radial side at the carpals. Flexor carpi ulnaris attaches to the ulnar side at the carpals. And palmaris longus attaches to the palmar aponeurosis. They all flex the wrist. They do all also do weak elbow flexion, and they're all on the anterior side of the forearm. So see how nice and regular and logical and predictable the names of these muscles are. So that's the anterior side. Those are the flexors. We're going to flip it over now and take a look at the posterior side of the forearm. Okay, posterior side of the right forearm. So let's orient ourselves. We're looking at a posterior view of the right forearm. So if you find your own posterior right forearm, you should be in the right place. Let's find some muscles that we looked at in previous videos because we know where they are. So here is triceps brachii, inserting at the olecranon process here. And here is anconeus, inserting on the proximal ulna. Okay, so there's anconeus right there. And so we're looking at the posterior side of the forearm. This is the superficial layer. We can, however, see flexor carpi ulnaris from this view because it's very much on the ulnar side. But even though we're looking at a posterior view, we can still see some of those anterior muscles if they're enough medial or enough lateral to see them from both sides. So this is flexor carpi ulnaris here. So let's take a look at the new, I got to point this out. I noticed as I was labeling this and getting ready to do this video that there's a mistake on this page. So I want you to cross out where it says ulnar and medial over here and write in radial and lateral, and cross out radial and lateral over here and write ulnar and medial. So that's a mistake in the book. Alrighty, let's look at the muscles on the posterior side of the forearm. And so this is the superficial layer, although we can see almost all of them, but we will take a look at a deeper layer here too. So first of all, we have So on the anterior side, of course, we had flexor, blah, blah, blah. On this side, we're going to see extensor, blah, blah, blah. So let's start with extensor carpi radialis. So remember, on the anterior side, we had extensor carpi radialis. On the posterior side, strangely enough, there are two of them. So we have to distinguish them from each other. So we have extensor carpi radialis longus and extensor carpi radialis brevis. So here is, here's longus. This is extensor carpi radialis. So similarly, like the muscles on the anterior side, these guys have a common proximal attachment, which I bet you can guess what it is. It is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, whereas, because, and why could you guess that? Because the ones on the anterior side had the common attachment of the medial epicondyle of the humerus. But then, you know, as the muscles work their way down, they're going to attach more to the radius and ulna in here, but the longest ones and the most superficial ones attach at the lateral epicondyle. Okay, so that's extensor carpi radialis longus. And then we have extensor carpi radialis brevis. I hope you guys are coloring right along. I'm sure you are, because by the time you're done watching this video, if you're coloring right along with me, then you should be pretty much done with your homework too. Now, of course, there are individual, there are pages with each of these muscles shown individually, and you certainly can go through and do those, but I think you should get a pretty good sense of things, you know, just doing these pages. So extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis. So what do we know about this muscle? About both of these, they are extensors, meaning they're on the posterior side of the forearm. They attach at carpals, meaning that they're going to work strongest on the wrist. They're on the radial side of the forearm, extensor carpi radialis, and longus is longer than brevis is. That's what we know from the names. So basically, these guys are going to do wrist extension, but being on the radial side of the forearm, they are also going to do radial deviation to the wrist. And I'm not sure if I mentioned that on the other side, but you know, flexor carpi ulnaris on the anterior side also does ulnar deviation, and flexor carpi radialis on the anterior side also does radial deviation. So, so they do actions other than the actions indicated in their name. So extensor carpi radialis longus, extensor carpi radialis brevis. Let's look at extensor digitorum. So extensor digitorum also only has two names, extensor digitorum, but that's okay because its name tells us everything we need to know. Extensor meaning it's on the posterior side of the forearm, therefore it does extension of the wrist and more, the wrist and the digits. So its name is extensor digitorum. So it does extension. Where does it do it? It inserts at the digits. At which digits? Probably digits 2 through 5. Although we're going to find that there are some individual digits here too, or individual muscles that go to specific digits. Extensor digitorum. Let's see. So what else do we? So it inserts at the digits. Therefore, it's going to extend the metacarpal phalangeal joints. So that's, and it only has two names because there is just one extensor digitorum. We don't have to distinguish it from, you know, a longer one or a deeper one or something like that, extensor digitorum. We will see, you know, an extensor that goes to the index finger and an extensor that goes to the little finger, but those will have their own specific names like extensor indicis and extensor digiti minimi. So this one is extensor digitorum. It goes to all the digits. Let's move on and look at, well, heck, since we're talking about it, we could talk about extensor digiti minimi next. Extensor digiti minimi is right next door to extensor digitorum, which makes sense because, so this guy's going to go out to digit 5. And so, you know, so you can see it's still, these guys are going up to sharing this common proximal attachment, and you can follow this tendon all the way down here, and we're heading out to, you can follow the tendon of the previous one too, if you'd like. Is this the color I used? Yes. Out to these digits. Okay. So that orange one there is extensor digiti minimi, so it's going to extend the little finger. That's what its name tells us, and that is what it does, extension of digit 5. Let's look at the next one over, which is extensor carpi ulnaris. So extensor carpi ulnaris is here. So it's on the ulnar side of the forearm, like its name tells us. It is on the posterior side of the forearm, like its name tells us. So extensor carpi ulnaris, so it does extension where? Well, its second word is carpi, meaning it attaches at a carpal, meaning the next most proximal joint is the wrist. So it's going to extend the wrist, and it's on the ulnar side of the forearm. So it not only extends the wrist, but it also does ulnar deviation at the wrist. Okay, let's see. This is extensor digiti minimi here. And, okay, I think that's all that we've talked about now. So those are the ones that are a little more superficial. There are some deeper ones here too, but they're still pretty superficial. So there are 3 of them here that we can see on this level. So let's keep going on this diagram. These 3, let's start with abductor pollicis longus. So here's our first one that is kind of a different moving name, abductor, abductor. So what does that mean? It means it abducts pollicis, the thumb, abductor pollicis longus. It also means we can guess that once we get to the intrinsic muscles of the hand, we're going to meet an abductor pollicis brevis. But this is abductor pollicis longus, so it abducts the thumb, meaning like this, abduction, AB. It takes the thumb away from the rest of the hand, abduction. Abductor pollicis longus, so it attaches to the base of metacarpal 1. And it is, and, you know, I mean, it's here grouped with these posterior forearm muscles, but it's fairly on the radial side, of course, because it goes to the thumb. So that's abductor pollicis longus. Right next door to abductor pollicis longus is extensor pollicis brevis. Extensor pollicis brevis is here. So it's on the extensor side, and it does extension at the thumb, extensor pollicis brevis. So it's brevis, meaning short. So brevis means short and longus means long, meaning that it goes to the proximal phalanx of the thumb. Whereas longus is going to go to the distal phalanx of the thumb. So extensor pollicis brevis will extend the thumb. And extensor pollicis longus is going to extend the thumb, but at the interphalangeal joint, whereas extensor pollicis brevis will extend the thumb at the metacarpal phalangeal joint. So let's look at extensor pollicis longus, the last one that we can see on this diagram here. Extensor pollicis longus is going to go all the way out to that distal phalanx of the thumb and extend the interphalangeal joint of the thumb. Okay, so we also can see the extensor retinaculum here, which helps to keep all of these tendons all situated and in place and help them to do their functions. Let's go ahead and look at the deeper layer of the posterior view. So we can, I think there's just one more muscle that we can see here. So we, let's see, we just did extensor pollicis longus, which is this one. So now we can see more of that muscle. We can see it attaching to the ulna up here and see it coming down. We don't see it going all the way out to the distal phalanx, but on other diagrams we can. That's extensor pollicis longus. Extensor pollicis brevis is, oh my gosh, oh no, what color did I use? Was it this one? Extensor pollicis brevis, let's hope it was this color. It's this one, going out to the proximal phalanx of the thumb. And then on the previous page we also saw abductor pollicis, which is here. We can see a nerve going through here, which is the posterior interosseous nerve. Interosseous is a term that means between the bones. There is a membrane between the radius and the ulna, and it's called the interosseous membrane. And some of these muscles actually even attach to that membrane. Okay, so there we go. That is abductor pollicis longus. And then the other muscle that we can see here that we couldn't see on the other diagram is extensor indicis. So I'm so running out of colors. Let's do this. Okay, extensor indicis is here. It's going out to the index finger. That's what indicis means. It refers to the index finger, extensor indicis. So that muscle is going to extend the index finger. So these are the 4 deeper ones on the extensor side. Let me point out we can also see supinator on this diagram. So anyway, these are the deeper 4 on the extensor side. They're not all extensors because we have abductor pollicis longus here. That is an abductor, but other than that, we have extensors. So extensor pollicis longus, extensor pollicis brevis, and extensor indicis. Okay, so that wraps up the extrinsic muscles of the posterior forearm. Now, what we have next is the intrinsic muscles of the hand, so the muscles that begin and end within the confines of the hand. Let's see, what are we looking at here? We're looking at a palmar view of the right hand. So, and this is the superficial layer. So we're going to take this superficial layer off so we can see the muscles, but I did want to just point this out, a couple things on this diagram. One is the palmar aponeurosis. So here you can see it in most of its glory. You can see it going to the digits and connecting to itself across here. That's the palmar aponeurosis. So again, aponeurosis is a broad, flat tendon, so it covers a larger area. And is always right below the skin wherever it attaches, so it kind of makes this broad attachment that also incorporates the skin into the muscles. But let me point out one thing. This is not on your list of muscles to know, but it helps prove the rule of the name of how these muscles work and how they're named. What's this guy here? Palmaris brevis, right? There wouldn't have been a palmaris longus if there wasn't somewhere a palmaris brevis. So palmaris longus and palmaris brevis both tie into the palmar aponeurosis. And so palmaris longus flexes the wrist, palmaris longus and brevis both help to kind of cup the hand. So they help to grip things by attaching to that palmar aponeurosis and controlling it. They can create sort of more subtle movements within the skin of the hand and helps to kind of cup the hand and help to grip things. So those are the palmar muscles, palmaris longus and palmaris brevis. Okay, let's look at the deeper layer. So here we're looking at a palmar view of the right hand. So find your own palmar view of your right hand. So you're clear about what we're looking at here. So if this was mine, it'd be like this, right? Palmar view of my right hand. So we're going to divide the palmar side of the hand into a couple of sections. We're going to divide it into the section here that is the thenar eminence, here that is the hypothenar eminence, and then this central region where everything else is. So let's start out with the thenar eminence, and then we'll move on to the hypothenar eminence. So the nice thing about those two sections is they have the same 3 muscles in them, but one is for the thumb and one is for the little finger. So so what are those 3 muscles that we have? Okay, let's look at abductor pollicis brevis. So again, here's a brevis that proves the rule of these names of these muscles and how they work. Abductor pollicis brevis. What must this muscle do? It abducts the thumb, abduction. So it pulls the thumb away from the rest of the hand. Abductor pollicis refers to the thumb, and brevis, meaning that this is short, meaning that this is an intrinsic thumb muscle. And remember, the other one that we looked at was abductor pollicis longus, which was an extrinsic hand muscle. That was just on we saw it on page 365 with the posterior forearm. See that guy? There's abductor pollicis. Longest right here. Here's abductor pollicis brevis. So it pulls the thumb away from the rest of the hand, abduction of the thumb. So abductor pollicis brevis. We also have flexor pollicis brevis, which we can't see super well here, but we can see it. It's right here. This is flexor pollicis brevis. So what must this muscle do? Flex the thumb, right? So it's on the palmar side, so it's positioned well to flex the thumb. And it just, both of these are going to the proximal phalanx, so they're going to work this joint, the metacarpal phalangeal joint of the thumb. Abductor pollicis brevis and flexor pollicis brevis. The third muscle we can't see on this layer. We have to go down a layer, and it's this one right here, opponens pollicis. So right here is opponens pollicis. What does opponens mean? It refers to opposition, right? Remember that movement opposition? That's the thumb being able to cross the hand and touch the other digits. That's opposition. So opponens pollicis is the muscle that draws the thumb across the hand. So those are the three muscles of the thenar eminence: opponens pollicis, flexor pollicis brevis, which we can see better here in this diagram. Here's flexor pollicis brevis, and abductor pollicis brevis, which has been cut away on this view, so we can see those deeper too. But it's here and here, okay? Abductor pollicis brevis. So we're going to find those same three muscles, except they're not going to be called pollicis, on the thenar eminence. So let's go back, first of all, to our superficial layer. And let's start with abductor pollicis. Oh, sorry, it's not pollicis because it's the little finger. So the term for the little finger is digiti minimi. So we have abductor digiti minimi. And so this one's actually called abductor digiti minimi manus. And so manus refers to the hand. So if we need to distinguish this muscle as manus, that probably means we're going to have a similar muscle where? Right on the foot, which would be called pedis. But here we're on the hand, and so we have abductor digiti minimi manus. So it abducts or draws away the little finger, digiti minimi, from the rest of the hand. Abductor digiti minimi manus. The next one is, let's see here, what's the next one? Flexor digiti minimi manus. So here is flexor digiti minimi manus. Okay, and that's going to flex the little finger. So flexor. So, and you can see where it attaches right here. So it attaches at the base of the proximal phalanx. So it's going to flex that metacarpal phalangeal joint. Flexor digiti minimi manus. And then the third one is opponens digiti minimi. Who knew that we had an opposable pinky? So let's see, I think we can see it better over here. So here is opponens. We can see it on that other diagram though, but we can only see a little sliver of it. So hopefully my background noises are not too loud for you right at this moment. Opponens digiti minimi is right there. Let's look at it on this one where we can see it. Right here, opponens digiti minimi. All right, I love the digiti minimis. It's the cutest name ever, don't you think? Opponens digiti minimi. Okay, so notice that the thenar eminence and the hypothenar eminence have the same three muscles: flexor, abductor, and opponens. The thenar eminence in Chinese medicine is referred to as the big fish. Hypothenar eminence in Chinese medicine is referred to as the little fish. But they have the same three muscles: flexor, abductor, and opponens. On the thumb side, it's going to be called pollicis. On the hypothenar eminence, or the little finger side, is going to be called digiti minimi. So those are those two sections of the hand. Now let's move on and look at the central section of the hand. And let's look at that on this deeper layer. So again, so we're still looking at the palmar aspect of the hand, and so a big muscle that we see here is adductor pollicis right here. So adductor pollicis, you can see, attaches to the third metacarpal, so that middle metacarpal, and there are actually a couple of sections to it. It's a pretty good sized muscle for a hand muscle, and then comes here and attaches to the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb. So if its name is adductor pollicis, what must it do? It must adduct the thumb. So it brings the thumb toward the rest of the hand. Adductor pollicis. And it is the muscle that makes up this web of the hand here. So like, for instance, large intestine 4 here, we're going to find there in the belly of that muscle. Even though on this diagram we're looking at the palmar side, you know, this muscle makes up the web, and so we can see it on the palmar and on the dorsal aspect of the hand. Okay, so that's adductor pollicis. Now, the only thing we have left are a few groups of muscles, of which there are many of them because they go to the digits, but there are a couple of simple groups. So let's see here. Let's look at, I guess since we're looking at this view, let's look at the the palmar interossei muscles. So the palmar interossei muscles, so we know the word interosseous means between bones, and palmar refers to the palmar side, the palm side. So palmar interossei, we're going to find them in a few places here. Let's see if I can find them all. There's palmar interossei. Here, palmar interosseous. Here. Okay, and we should have one right here. Palmar interosseous. Okay, so the palmar interossei are pretty easy to remember what they do. Did I miss one? No, I don't think I did. Okay, so palmar, can you see that? Palmar, the palmar interossei, so P for palmar, the palmar interossei muscles do adduction of the fingers. So if you can remember the word pad, then you have their action down. So palmar interossei do adduction, meaning, so remember that on the hand, the middle finger and the middle metacarpal is the midline of the hand. So if we're going to do adduction on the hand, we're going to adduct toward that midline. So we find a palmar interosseous here, and so this is a muscle that's going to adduct the index finger toward midline, and we're going to find a palmar interosseous muscle here that will adduct the fourth finger toward midline, and a palmar interosseous muscle here that will adduct the fifth finger, or digiti minimi, toward the midline. Okay, so palmar interossei muscles adduct, so they move the fingers toward the midline. Why don't we have one here at the thumb? Because the thumb has its own adductor called adductor pollicis. Right? The thumb always has its own muscle. It must have gotten some, like, good deal or something along the way. Okay, so that's the palmar side. Let me think here. Okay, here's the dorsal view. So here's dorsal view of the right hand. So flip your own hand over. You're looking now at the dorsal side of your right hand. And we can still see some of the same muscles, but I want to point out the dorsal interossei muscles on this view. So dorsal interossei are going to be, let's see, in lots of places. So here, that's a dorsal interosseous. Here's a dorsal interosseous. So they're on the dorsal side. They're between the bones. What bones are they between? They're essentially situated mostly between the metacarpal bones. That's where their name comes from. Here's a dorsal interosseous, and here is a dorsal interosseous. Okay, so the dorsal interossei muscles, what they do, the dorsal ones do abduction of the fingers. So if we can remember the word dab, that's going to tell us the action of the dorsal interossei muscle. So the dorsal interossei do abduction. So abduction is spreading the fingers. So what that means is, so on the palmar side, the middle finger, any side, the middle finger is the middle of the hand, marks that midline. But when we're talking about adduction, so when we're talking about the palmar interossei, there's no palmar interossei muscle that goes to the middle finger because it can't adduct to itself. It is the midline. But the index finger has one, the ring finger has one, the little finger has one. The thumb does not because it has its own adductor pollicis. On the dorsal side, we're going to have a dorsal interossei at the little finger, at the ring finger, at the first finger. Oh, sorry, let me think. I got confused. We're going this way, right? We're doing abduction. We do not have one on the pinky finger because it has its own abductor digiti minimi that is part of the hypothenar eminence, but we have one at the ring finger. We have one at the first finger. Again, same thing with the thumb. It has its own, so it's not a dorsal interossei muscle. And then the middle finger can abduct away from midline in either direction. So we might call it this radial deviation and ulnar deviation, but it has two dorsal interossei muscles attaching to it because it can deviate away from midline in either direction. So those are the dorsal interossei muscles that do abduction, abduction. They spread the fingers. Okay, and then one last group are the lumbricals, which we can see, and these are funny little muscles, the lumbricals. Let's see if we can see them better here or on the other diagram. I feel like maybe we can see them better on the palmar side. The lumbricals are, they're cut on this side. Don't worry too much about the lumbricals. Let's just say that. But here they are. They do a funny action of flexing the metacarpal phalangeal joints and extending the interphalangeal joints. So it's sort of a funny thing that they do, but it's that. And so we can see at least tendons of them there, but they're cut away. Which means we can probably see them on the, so here are the lumbricals here. So here's the lumbrical right here. There should be more here too. But anyway, so that's what the lumbricals are. Don't put too much energy into the lumbricals. All right, is that it? Okay, one last thing on this video. I know it's going on and on and on. I'm sorry, but there's 1,000 muscles here. And keep in mind, don't go nutso about these muscles. Get the logic of them so that you can figure out what muscles what when you're looking at it. But I just wanted to just quickly go over a few of the key acupuncture points that we use some of these tendons to locate. So let's take a look on my hand here. So let's start here. Looks a little shadowy. Can you see it? I feel like I need to get better light. Too much light. Okay. Here we go. We're just going to assume that you can see this okay. All right, so here is large intestine 5. So large intestine 5 is between extensor pollicis brevis and extensor pollicis longus. So those are those two tendons here. So this is extensor pollicis brevis. This is extensor pollicis longus. You can follow that one out to the distal phalanx. Extensor pollicis brevis is going to go to the proximal phalanx. But those two tendons, extensor pollicis longus and extensor pollicis brevis, form what's called the anatomical snuff box right there, and inside that anatomical snuff box we have large intestine 5. So that's one point there. We have extensor digitorum. So this is extensor digitorum tendon in through here, and so then just on the ulnar side of extensor digitorum and on the on the radial side of extensor digiti minimi, between those two tendons, we have Sanjiao 4. Okay, so that's right there, Sanjiao 4. Hope you can see it okay. There's Sanjiao 4. And then here we have, this is the triquetrum, sorry, yeah, that's right. This is the triquetrum bone. We also, I didn't draw it on, but you can see the head of the ulna right there. So between the head of the ulna and the triquetrum bone, there's a little divot in there where we find small intestine 5. Between the triquetrum bone and the base of the fifth metacarpal, there's a little divot, and we can find small intestine 4 there. Over on the palmar side, we have, so if we can find the tendon to palmaris longus and the tendon to flexor carpi radialis, those two tendons have between them pericardium 6 and pericardium 7 and pericardium 6. And then if we can find the tendon for flexor carpi radialis, which is right here, just on the ulnar side, on the radial side of flexor carpi. Oh, wait a second, that's flexor carpi ulnaris. I put that initial wrong. This would be flexor carpi ulnaris. So just on the radial side of that is heart 7. Okay, so if you can find those tendons on yourself and find those points on yourself, that can be helpful. Okay, and then you can find more points. Excuse me. You can find more points going up the forearm and find their relationship to muscles that we've talked about, and more points down into the hand and their relationships to some of the muscles and tendons that we've talked about. All right, so I didn't mention on the previous video that the word that tells me that you watched that video is bunny. And because he made a little sneak appearance on the table while I was drawing Anconius. His name is Boomy Bunny, and he's white and fluffy and cute. So that's bunny. That's our B-U-N-N-Y. That's the word for our previous video, which was video 10. This is video 11, and let's say that our word is sneeze. Even though we don't want to hear anybody sneezing so much, it is sort of allergy time, and I just sneezed. So sneeze, S-N-E-E-Z-E, is our word for video 11, this video. Okay, next we're going to move away from muscles and get back to bones and take a look at the bones of the spine and the thorax, which means that very soon we're heading in toward muscles of the torso. And there's a lot there, so that's kind of our direction where we're heading next. But coming up soon also is the midterm, and we'll be talking about that in class on Friday. Okie dokie, that's it for video 11. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next video.